Colorado versus James Egan Holmes, case number 12CR1522. The record should reflect that Mr. Holmes is present with his attorneys and the prosecutors are present as well. We are outside the presence of the jury. The juror who has a medical appointment downtown today is indicating that her appointment is at 2:30 and she could not change it. So I think what we'll plan to do is break between 1:30 and 3:30 and hope that she's back by 3:30, but with the understanding that we may have to wait a little later than 3:30 for her to get back here. So, all right. Are you ready for the jury, folks?
Yes, sir.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, let's bring them in, please.
Is it better for you?
Please be seated, everyone. The record should reflect that the jury has joined us again. Welcome back, members of the jury. Just a quick scheduling note. So we are going to go ahead and take our lunch break today between 1:30 and 3:30 with the understanding that we may have to start a little later than 3:30. It depends on whenever the juror gets back from her appointment. So, but the plan is between 1:30 and 3:30. And so we'll take another break before 1:30, and then we'll take the 2-hour lunch break, and then we'll plan to go until 5:30. Before Mr. King proceeds with the rest of his cross-examination, I want to remind you that the court has admitted this testimony from Dr. Reed only for a limited purpose. You may consider this testimony only as to the issues raised by the defendant's plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. You shall not consider this evidence for any other purpose. Dr. Reed, I remind you that you're still under oath.
Yes, sir.
Mr. King, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Doctor, I want to clear up a couple things about the jail that I think I made a mistake or a partial mistake about. The incident that I talked about where Mr. Holmes was allegedly trying to start a fire with a water bottle, I think involved the light from his lamp in his cell and not sunlight. You don't recall seeing that incident on the video, do you?
It may have been there, but I don't recall, and I know that his window was very high and not much direct sunlight came in.
Do you recall ever reading an incident report about that, or a deputy sheriff report about that happening?
I think I do, but it may just be because you said it.
Right, that's how memory works, right?
You're correct.
When you say something, you may think that you remember it.
That's right.
What was the lamp in his room like? Do you remember when you went in there?
I don't remember as I sit here. My impression is that it was certainly a built-in thing. There was a switch on the wall. The short answer is I don't remember. I'm quite sure it wouldn't have been a loose lamp with a cord, for example.
Right. That wouldn't be necessarily safe in a jail.
Right.
The other thing I wanted to clear up was the BC room, the rubber room. When Mr. Holmes was moved in there in November, you have no indication that he was moved in there because he was a behavior problem, do you? Meaning that he did something wrong. It was rather that he was, they thought he was going to injure himself.
It was a matter of safety for him, yes.
Now, schizophrenia, sir. Well, let me ask you this. In terms of schizotypal personality disorder, the natural course of the disorder is generally stable, without marked improvement or deterioration. Extraordinary stressors, which may or may not be obvious to observers, since they may be idiosyncratic to a particular patient, may be associated with additional symptoms, including brief acute psychosis. Correct?
That's fair to say, and I think you're reading from either my report or the DSM.
So given stress, there can be periods of acute psychosis in a schizotypal personality disorder diagnosis.
That's correct.
If the psychosis lasts longer, that's kind of where the criteria for schizophrenia is, right? The psychosis has to last for a 6-month period of time. Is that right?
Certain symptoms have to be present for at least 6 months unless the symptoms have been treated and are decreased because of treatment. And that's where you get into have things become schizophrenic, or are they still schizotypal, things like that.
Let me ask you about these disorders, generally speaking. Now, some of the disorders that are in this book here, the DSM, are really personality disorders in the sense that they are a reflection of just a person's behaviors and not a disease of the mind necessarily. Is that fair to say?
The DSM purposely uses the word disorder rather than illness throughout its definitions. I'm pretty sure that carries into DSM-5 as well. So it doesn't speak of illnesses, it speaks of disorders. Some of those may be categorized at various times by various people as illnesses, or in legal context as defects or something like that, if that's what you mean to say.
Yes, and some of the disorders, like, for example, Alzheimer's. Is that in the DSM-5?
Yes, it is.
That's not just a symptoms of bad behavior or abnormal behavior. That's an actual disease of the brain, correct?
We think that it all has to do with what goes on inside the brain, chemically and electrically, but I think what you're referring to is in Alzheimer's disease, there are things we can find physically in the brain that are highly correlated with the memory problems, etc., of Alzheimer's, and some disorders like that are in the DSM, as contrasted with mental disorders that outwardly anyway appear to be just related to feelings or behavior or perceptions, things like that.
And schizophrenia is like the former as well, isn't that right? It's more like dementia or Alzheimer's. We're
learning more about the neurology and the neurophysiology of schizophrenia. I wouldn't call myself an expert in that part of it, but there are behavioral characteristics certainly. I would not classify it as like schizophrenia. a neurophysiologist might draw a closer comparison.
And like you said, and you said this quite openly before, you're not a neurologist, is that right? And
I'm not.
that's not your area of specialty, nor are you a specialist in schizophrenia necessarily.
In the subspecialty of schizophrenia, I've seen hundreds of schizophrenic patients over the years, but I would not call myself a schizophrenia specialist or researcher, for example. No.
And certainly Dr. Gurr is a psychiatrist and a neurologist as well, correct?
That's my understanding, is that she has had training in both. A
And
specific specialty training. Every physician has training in neurology. My understanding is that Dr. Gurr has gone on for post-MD training in neurology.
and she does have a specialty in schizophrenia, is that right?
That's my understanding.
And she does do research in the area of schizophrenia.
That's my understanding.
Now, part of this, what we're talking about here is that there's clear indications in the literature and elsewhere that there's a genetic component to schizophrenia, correct?
Correct.
A propensity to have schizophrenia as a risk factor is inherited, much like some of us may inherit a risk factor for heart disease or cancer, something like that.
I don't know that the genetics are that known, but it's certainly true that if certain kinds of close relatives have clear schizophrenia, your risk goes up substantially. If more distant relatives have it, your risk goes up in some statistical way, but perhaps not substantially.
This is 508, ma'am. Your Honor, I'm marking this as DTR-26. I want to show it to counsel. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Me.
Sir, I'm handing you what I've marked as DTR-26. That was a document that was provided to you by the defense. Is that correct?
It probably was. I don't remember the specific page, but so that's my answer to that particular question.
And what that is a letter from a psychiatrist of Mr. Holmes's aunt, correct?
Correct.
And what that letter indicates
sustain as to the lack, well, he's not moving at this time to admit it, but to the extent that he hasn't been admitted, you can't ask about the contents of it. So the objection is sustained in terms of lack of foundation with respect to the contents of it.
you reviewed all of the documentation that you were given in the course of conducting your evaluation and making your decisions in this case. Is that right?
Not every page. There were certain things, as I've mentioned, that I really assumed were not relevant,
Okay.
that I didn't review. The things that had to do with Mr. Holmes' family, things like that, that were available to me, I did review.
So you did review that letter, then you think, because that relates to his family. Is that right?
If that letter was in the big box, I almost certainly reviewed it.
And certainly, based on what your testimony has just been about the fact that when close relatives have a disease, that it can increase the likelihood that this person is diagnosed with that disease, that would be something that you would want to at least consider in rendering your opinion, forming the basis for your opinion.
With regard to diagnosis, you're correct.
Your Honor, I'd move to admit D-TR-26.
Would counsel approach, please? The objection is sustained on foundational grounds, but Mr. King, you may proceed as we discussed at the bench in attempting to establish additional foundation. And Mr. King, it's my understanding that you want to relabel this as D-TR-25. Is that correct?
Yes, Judge, and I apologize for the numbering error.
That's okay. No apology necessary. All right. So this is D-TR-25. Mr. King, you may proceed.
25. Sir, is family information, history of family members, mental illnesses, as is contained in that document, the type of information that you and other psychiatrists would regularly review in the course of conducting a forensic evaluation such as this in order to contribute to and help support your opinions and diagnoses?
Yes, with regard to diagnosis.
Judge, I would move for the admission of D-TR-25, please.
Any additional objection? No, sir. Thank you. All right. Without objection, then D-TR-25 is admitted and may be published. Members of the jury, this exhibit is being admitted not for the truth of the contents of the exhibit. Rather, it has been admitted only to explain the basis for this witness's expert opinions. You may not consider this evidence for any other purpose. Okay, you may proceed.
Could we publish that, please, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
What this is, Doctor, is a letter, excuse me, to an attorney from a doctor. It regards a person by the name of Betty Holmes. Is that right?
Yes.
And you're aware that Betty Holmes, this is Mr. James Holmes' paternal aunt. Is that right?
Yes.
She is, in fact, the fraternal twin of his father, Mr. Robert Holmes, Jr.
I'm not sure I knew that, but I may have.
And what this document indicates is that Betty Holmes has been seen at this mental health agency in Santa Cruz, California, since 1983. Is that right?
Yes.
She told one of her therapists that she had her first breakdown at the age of 19. Is that right?
That's what the letter says.
Is it common that the onset of, or breakdown, which would be the onset of florid psychosis, as you say, in schizophrenia or other related disorders, often can come when a person is in their early 20s or around the age of 20?
Yes.
It indicates that she's been hospitalized 4 times in a psychiatric hospital in Santa Cruz for having hallucinations, psychotic symptoms, and suicidal ideation. Is that correct?
Yes.
It also indicates that she's been on psychiatric medication since 1983. Is that right?
Yes.
And it indicates that she has been on Social Security since her diagnosis in 1983.
I assume that means Social Security disability, yes.
And the diagnosis is schizoaffective disorder. Is that correct?
That's what Dr. Natu says.
And that's in the schizophrenia spectrum of disorders that we've described previously, correct?
Yes, it is.
And that's what Dr. Metzner, the other court's expert, has diagnosed Mr. Holmes with. Is that correct?
I believe you're correct.
And that's what Dr. Woodcock has also diagnosed Mr. Holmes with. Is that correct?
At least in one of his reports, he had some other diagnoses at various times as well.
You can take that down, ma'am. Thank you. Are you also aware that of other problems that Mr. Holmes' grandfathers had with mental illness?
There was at least something that stood out, and I want to say something about severe depression in a grandfather, but there was what sounds like a severe mental illness in the grandfather. May I make one quick correction or comment about Betty Holmes?
Sure.
If she is the fraternal twin of Mr. Holmes' father, I just want to be clear that being a fraternal twin, as contrasted with an identical twin, is genetically the same or nearly the same as being just another brother or sister. I just want to clarify that it wasn't an identical twin, because that has genetic significance.
Right, and that's why I said
Sure,
fraternal
and
twin
you
instead
said
of
that. That's
identical
correct.
twin. Nevertheless, the fact that relatives have a related disorder is a factor to consider.
Yes, it is. In diagnosis, yes.
And do you recall that both his maternal grandfather and his paternal grandfather were hospitalized in psychiatric hospitals in their lives?
I can go to my report to see. I'm not certain as I sit here that that's true. I'm fairly certain at least one of them was, and if you're reading from something that I should have seen, I'm happy to accept that.
That's fine. If you don't recall that as
Okay.
you sit here, that's fine.
Okay.
We can talk to other people about that.
Okay.
I want to talk to you about a few things that you put in your report about delusional disorder. And first of all, you talked about how if you diagnose someone with schizophrenia, it precludes the diagnosis or includes the diagnosis of schizotypal personality disorder. Fair to say?
I'm not aware in the DSM-5 that the two can, according to the nomenclature, coexist. Now, things are still in a human being, but once the diagnosis of schizophrenia is accurately made, I believe the diagnosis of schizotypal personality disappears. I could be corrected on that.
That's called an exclusionary diagnosis. Is that right?
If that's what DSM-5 says, then I'm happy to agree. Oh, I see what you mean. As one is trying to diagnose schizotypal personality, if the patient is known to have schizophrenia, then the schizotypal personality is not a reasonable diagnosis, if that's what you mean. Yeah.
That is exactly what I mean. Thank you.
Okay.
In addition to schizotypal personality disorder, you've also diagnosed Mr. Holmes with a possible delusional disorder. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that's also in this section of schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders
Yes.
in the DSM-5.
Yes.
A delusional disorder is characterized by the presence of one or more delusions for over a month. Other criteria are required as well. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, oftentimes, and help me if I'm not phrasing this correctly. Oftentimes, someone who has a delusional disorder diagnosis, the delusions are more encapsulated than perhaps the delusions in the schizophrenic patient are. Am I phrasing that correctly?
You are, and that's a reasonable way to put it. Very often in delusional disorder, most parts of the person's life and getting along with life are not delusional or unusual, but some major part is.
Oftentimes, people with delusional disorders, it can go unnoticed. Fair to say?
Fair to say.
For example, Mr. Brockler may be very fond of Justin Bieber, right? And, maybe he thinks that he has delusionally thinks he has a special connection to Justin Bieber. But he doesn't, I don't think. If in fact that were a fixed false belief that Mr. Brockler had, that would be a delusion, or could be, correct?
Yes.
Now, if Mr. Brockler then went and bought tickets and went to every concert that the Beeb threw, that might not appear to others as delusional, right?
Right, and may not have to do with the delusion. Simply being a fan is not the point, but you mentioned believing a special connection, that he was invited to come, or that Bieber expected to see him in the
If
audience, or
Bieber
something
didn't
like
see him there, Bieber's going to be disappointed.
something like that.
Now, maybe he goes out and he buys all of Justin's records and plays the music all the time. that may be the result of the delusion, but that may not be obvious to others who are on the outside who may just say, well, he's just a big fan, right?
Correct.
So people with this disorder can labor under these delusions, but it may go unnoticed by anyone, right?
That certainly happens.
Delusional disorder is chronic and lifelong with no known cure. Correct?
Correct.
In your opinion, if a diagnosis of delusional disorder is appropriate, you believe that first onset sometime early in the year of 2012, correct?
I'm not sure exactly what I said in my report, and I want to be consistent with that, but that's a likelihood. I'm thinking now about going back into 2011, and let me just look in the report
Feel free.
because that helps with my memory. I think that's accurate.
So you think the schizotypal personality disorder started much earlier, but then the possible delusional disorder started after he was already in graduate school. Fair to say?
I think that's a likely scenario. I don't want to say that the schizotypal disorder was showing itself in the same way earlier, but there were reasonable signs of it that one could follow along up through graduate school.
As in schizotypal personality disorder, there can be acute psychotic episodes in a delusional disorder as well. Is that right?
There can be.
Usually fairly brief. Is that right?
Usually and around the theme of the delusion.
And with particular stressors, idiosyncratic stressors that might relate to the delusion itself, right?
Yes.
A portion of people with delusional disorder eventually develop schizophrenia. Isn't that right?
Correct.
You have testified here that you lean towards the human capital concept being a delusion, correct?
Boy, I'll go back and forth on that. The idea that Mr. Holmes doesn't describe it as of 2014 as a real thing leans me away from it. It might be more accurate to say that I wouldn't argue with somebody very vigorously who thought either way.
Well, I remember you testifying yesterday under oath that you leaned towards it being a delusion.
Okay, and if that's what I said, I'll certainly stand by that.
You wrote in your report that it is likely that Mr. Holmes' belief that he could accrue for himself some value from each of the people he killed does reach delusional proportions, and that it was established long before the shootings. That's
Yes.
page 8.
Yes, and that I would certainly stand by that statement.
Also, page 8, his preoccupation with viewing himself as flawed and his hoping for relief in the act of killing others are consistent with delusional thinking, but also with the broader concept of schizotypal personality disorder as well as schizophrenia. Correct?
I don't see exactly where you cite that, but if that's the reading from page 8, and it sounds very correct. It sounds correct.
On page 11, you write, it is likely that Mr. Holmes' stated beliefs or philosophy with regard to human capital reach a level of delusion. Correct?
Just for complete list. Let me find where on page 11 I say that, but I'm sure you're correct. Yes, I say that. That's not the entire sentence. The sentence goes on to say, but he consistently described his human capital beliefs as coming entirely from him, comma, often using the term arbitrary, and denied that they represent any particular truth. He made it clear, to the extent that his statements can be accepted as accurate, that they exist because he believes them and that they are irrelevant to those who do not.
And that's the after the comma is what you read, is that right?
Correct.
And so despite what came after the comma, what before the comma is still true, that it is likely that Mr. Holmes' stated beliefs or philosophy with regard to human capital reach a level of delusion. That's your opinion, right?
Within the context of the entire sentence.
I have just a moment here, Judge. I'm trying to move through.
Take your time.
Now, Mr. Brockler brought up with you yesterday the idea that, and I think you agreed with him, that Mr. Holmes never described to you that the value that he received was a tangible thing. I think the word Mr. Brockler used was theoretical, or maybe I would use the word intellectual. In other words, I'm not really being very artful here with my words. Mr. Holmes never told you that the value that he received was that it made him feel pleasure, did he?
Not pleasure. He liked the fact that he's a 13, not a 1, but it was not tangible. He used the word arbitrary, that there was not a way to define it further than I like it better than being a 1.
And there's no indication that Mr. Holmes thought he received a benefit because he's now somehow famous or in the newspaper. No indication of that.
The wanting to be remembered has to do with some photographs that we discussed yesterday. I do not have any indication that the particular shooting acts had to do with a wish to be famous.
Nor do they have to do with the fact that others would write to him in the jail and that's somehow a benefit to him or something along those lines.
Not that I know of.
The value or the benefit to him was theoretical or mental, I guess. Fair to say?
Fair to say.
Now, at some point in your examination of Mr. Holmes, he said exactly what you just indicated, and this is on page 283 and 284, excuse me, of the transcript. And what he said was, value means that they are worth it. Or, excuse me, value means what they are worth. You recall that?
I don't recall the specific words, but if you're reading from the transcript, I'll accept that they're there.
And then he said, I don't know how else to explain it.
I missed the page number. I'm sorry.
284. Now, he talked about whether or not Mr. Holmes felt that the human capital delusion, I'm going to use the word delusion, concept, applied to other people or not. And there's, well, let me ask you this. On page 373 of the transcript, you asked him if someone were to kill you, would they get 1? And Mr. Holmes said, quote, if they give me the death penalty, somebody would get 1. Right?
That phrase is there within the context. As I recall, he went on to say fairly quickly that it depended on whether the person shared his thoughts or not, shared his belief.
And he said that I guess it could be the person who makes the lethal injection concoction or the person who presses the injection button, or could even go with the jury. Is that right?
I'm sure you're reading it correctly.
With regard to the value of 1, he said to you, it's kind of like the value of $1. Not really worth anything, but you attribute value to it. Correct?
I remember that.
You asked him, do you think there are any other people who have figured out the system independent of you? And he answered, well, there are 7 billion people, so maybe, right?
I recall us saying something like that, yes.
You then asked him, is it a system that is there to discover? Or is it a system you invented so it is not out there for others to discover because it is only in your mind? And he said, I invented the arbitrary value, but they could come up with the same value system. Correct?
I recall he said something like that. I'm sure you're accurate in reading it.
Do you recall at one point you're asking him if the value system applied to him or to everyone else, and he said, this is on page 47, quote, I believe it to be objective. And then you asked a follow-up question, if you weren't here, would the value system still be here? And his response was yes. You remember that?
I recall a context of that. If I'm recalling correctly, he said that within his subjective thought, it was objective, and that it would still be here because he had written it down and told other people about it.
Within his subjective opinion, it was objective.
I don't know if he used the word opinion, but it went first through his subjective mind to be what he thought was objective in a subjective way. That wasn't entirely clear to me, but that was the way it was expressed.
A little bit confusing.
A little bit confusing.
A little bit difficult to parse it out, right?
In that particular sentence, yes.
He's describing things 2 years later in a medicated state, trying to talk about what he was thinking 2 years before when he was unmedicated in a very different state of mind.
That's a true statement.
He's trying to make sense of it.
And I believe part of it was trying to tell me, and part of it was trying to make it make sense inside him.
Make some logical sense inside him.
And when I say logical, I don't necessarily mean logical as you or I might see the logic, but something so that it would not generate too much anxiety inside him, something to resolve whatever conflict there might be so that he would be more comfortable with whatever the facts were.
Now, you testified on direct examination something along the lines of, and this may be part of why you diagnosed a possible delusional disorder instead of schizophrenia, that part of it was that, I think the quote that I noticed was, he was going to class, he had fewer classes and more labs, he was going to the fitness center, in January and February, a little more than once a week, twice a week. No indication that I know of, that he wasn't carrying on his usual life during the months from February to June, correct?
That's what I said. I would correct the fitness center part. Now that having seen the logs, he was going to the fitness center up through early July, but essentially what you said.
And you are particularly interested in how he's functioning during those months of April, May, June, and July. Is that right?
Sure.
Now, during those months, Mr. Holmes, well, previous to this, there had been no indication that Mr. Holmes was interested in weapons. Is that right?
Previous to 2012.
Previous to 2012?
Correct.
No interest in warfare or things like that. Is that fair?
Except in video games, which were not shooter games, yeah.
And the video,
so far as I know.
The video games he played were games of strategy more so than pointing and shooting people, right?
That's my impression. I looked up a couple of them. I'm also not a video game expert, but I did look up a couple of them, and I talked with him about that.
Now, during this period of time, or previous to this, there's no history of Mr. Holmes harming others either, is there?
Not that I think the answer is no. There's something in the history long ago, one person said he slapped his sister when he was a little boy or something like that, but that's a long time before. The answer to your question is I don't see any indication of violence or propensity toward violence prior to 2012.
And he talked with you about killing some ants and then some snails when he was a little boy with his friends.
Yes, he did.
Any particular significance to that?
No, I kind of am looking for some of the stereotypic connections between childhood cruelty and adult criminality, and did not find that. Lots of kids burn ants and crush snails.
He wasn't like torturing animals or lighting fires or those kinds of classic things that you're looking for.
Certainly nowhere in the record.
And then in 2012, he certainly is going to the gym, right?
As far as I know, in 2012, you're correct, he is.
He's still going to class, right?
Yes.
He's not doing as well in his labs, though. That's different, right?
There are indications that he was not performing very well. I don't know comparatively first quarter, second quarter, third quarter. The implication is that he was not doing as well in 2012.
And he was purchasing weapons, which was different for him, correct?
Correct.
He was purchasing armaments or weapons-related paraphernalia, which was extremely out of the ordinary for him, correct?
Correct.
He was buying massive quantities of ammunition, way more than were used or needed. Fair to say?
Way more than were used or needed for the shootings. My understanding is that he shot up the great majority of it. There was a little left in his apartment. I don't recall that anyone found huge amounts of unspent ammunition in his apartment.
Suffice it to say that prior to 2012, he never bought any ammunition of any kind.
As far as anybody knows, that's correct.
And prior to 2012, he never took a motorcycle class, did he? And he did that in the spring of 2012.
I looked for evidence of that motorcycle class, and I'm not certain he did that, but it was mentioned somewhere in the record.
During that period of time, he told you, and he wrote in the notebook, that he was experiencing some strange symptoms, that he felt really unable to move, that he felt depressed. This is what he told you, is that right?
Yes.
During that period of time in the spring of 2012, he dyed his hair bright red.
Yes.
That was unusual for him.
He had, so far as he says, not dyed his hair before.
He was not seeing his friends anymore. Is that right?
At some point, he stopped seeing his friends, or his friends stopped seeing him. He was not willing to engage with at least some of his friends, and eventually any of his friends that I know of.
And you kind of called him out on deleting the numbers from his phone, right? He didn't just stop calling them, he deleted their numbers.
That's what he said.
So he had the loss of like 5 friends in a couple of weeks because of his choice, right?
He drifted away from those friends. As a matter of fact, he considers them still his friends, but stopped the contact with them. To some extent, that's a loss. To some extent, it's simply stopping contact because he wanted to stop contact.
He indicated to you that weeks before the shooting, he all of a sudden stopped playing video games and attached no importance to Diablo 3, correct?
I don't remember much about that. I remember him talking about Diablo 3 not being a very good game, not as good as Diablo 2 or something like that. I don't remember him saying that he stopped all video games at some point. Wait, there is that implication because I wondered about, quote, withdrawal from video games. So I'm not remembering, but there's indication that what you say is true.
That's the way memory works, right?
That's the way memory works.
During that period of time, he had conversations with his girlfriend on a Gmail chat where he talked about this human capital concept, right?
Yes.
March?
I believe it was March with Gargi Data.
That had never happened before, to your knowledge.
A communication of those thoughts with someone, I believe that was the first known communication of those thoughts to anyone.
And he told you that somehow when he told her that, it made it real somehow. Is that right?
I believe he told me, as well as telling other people, that it made it at least more real, and I think he used the words, it made it real.
During that period of time, he went to see Dr. Fenton of his own volition, or perhaps by the suggestion of his girlfriend as well, or Gargi as well. Is that right?
That's right. Or referred to her. He went to the clinic, saw Dr. Roth, and then voluntarily went to Dr. Fenton at Dr. Roth's referral, or Ms. Roth's referral.
And he'd never voluntarily gone to a psychiatrist before, had he?
Not to my knowledge. As a child, we talk about the therapists and stuff, but not as a teenager or adult, as far as I know.
Now, when he went in and talked to Margaret Roth, the social worker, and she's an LCSW, right? Licensed clinical social worker.
That's my understanding. She is a clinical social worker of some sort.
And so that's someone with some mental health specialty. Is that fair to say?
Sure, often very good counselor.
Not a doctor, but someone with some advanced degree.
Sure.
And he told her on the first visit that he had thoughts about killing people. Correct?
That's what she documented, yes.
And she said that he was the most anxious person she'd ever seen in her notes.
Yes.
And he continued going there throughout the spring until the last meeting, which was on June 11th, 2012. Is that right?
Yes. There were a couple of reschedulings and things, but he kept the appointments that were set reasonably so.
I think you talked yesterday about a mental status exam that you did. Was that right?
Yes.
What's a mental status exam?
A mental status exam is a formalized way, a structured way of thinking about how the person's mind is working on the spot at the time. Sometimes you carry it out over a short time, asking questions or testing things out. Other times, as I tended to do, over the course of the interviews, I was aware of things that were part of the mental status examination, and so collated all that to become a written mental status exam.
And a mental status examination is something that's routinely done by mental health professionals in the course of conducting their business. Is that right?
In the course of evaluations, sure.
And in fact, it was done by Ms. Roth and Dr. Fenton as well. Is that
Yes.
correct? Ms. Roth did a mental status exam on the 23rd of March 2012 at 2:22 p.m., correct?
I'm not certain of the date, but she did such an exam.
And in such an exam, the way you report it is you report different things. Appearance well-groomed, she wrote, for example. Is that right?
As I sit here, I don't remember but the specific words, but I can picture the note that you're talking about, and I'm happy to look at it if you'd like for me to do that.
Would it refresh your recollection to take a look at this?
Sure.
This is 375, ma'am. Judge, just for the record, I'm going to mark it as DTR 26.
Okay.
Is that right?
That's right.
May I approach the witness?
Yes.
I'm going to show it to counsel. This is the first one. This is the last one. Yes. I'm showing you DTR 26.
Let me give you those with that one, 26.
Yeah, I'm going to renumber this one 25. If I may approach the court reporter with 25, Your Honor.
Yes. That one was admitted. Thank you.
26 is a combination of the mental status exam on the top from March and the mental status exam from June on the bottom. Is that right?
It appears to be. It's apparently pasted together from different pages, and the June one must be Dr. Fenton. The March one, I can't tell whether it's Ms. Roth or Dr. Fenton, but
Okay.
it's titled Mental Status Exam.
Does that refresh your recollection as to what the contents of those mental status exams were?
Of these two exams, to the extent that they're complete, the bottom one may go on after that,
Yes.
but it tells me what they wrote.
May I approach and retrieve the exhibit?
Yes, you may.
Let me just, if I may, just go down so that you can ask me questions about it and I'll remember.
Sure. I can ask them from right here if you'd like.
That would be great. Then
Would
I
that
can
be
see it.
appropriate, Judge?
That's okay.
In March, the mental status exam reports that his appearance is well-groomed, his attitude is cooperative, psychomotor normal, mood normal, affect appropriate, speech normal, thought process logical, goal-directed, thought content without delusions, perceptual without hallucinations, cognition, normal cognition. Am I getting it right?
You're getting it right as she wrote it. I remember having some arguments with whether what she said in her note actually reflected what she wrote in that exam.
Okay. What she wrote in here, though, was cognition, normal cognition, full level of consciousness, memory intact, intelligence average, judgment intact, insight intact, reasoning, normal reasoning, no hallucinations. Correct?
That's what she wrote. Once again, I had arguments with some of those based on what she said she saw in Mr. Holmes.
Understood. And you had arguments, but this is what she wrote down in her report in March of 2012.
In that part of
The mental status exam.
the chart. That's what she wrote down.
And
Or that's what was typed. She may have had a longhand version. I just don't know the answer to that.
Okay. In the mental status exam from June 11th, the appointment in June 11th, which was the last appointment, was it not?
Yes, it was.
Attitude, contemptuous, devaluing, evasive, guarded, suspicious, uncooperative. Affect, anxiety, hostility, odd, bizarre, inappropriate. Thought process, intermittently odd and hard to follow. Thought content, paranoid delusions, preoccupations. Perceptual, denies hallucinations but does glance around the room in an odd way. Violent thoughts, homicidal thoughts. Did I read that correctly, sir?
Yes, you did. There are some things that you skipped, but yes.
Judge, I'd move the admission of DTR 26.
Any objection? Why don't you approach? The objection is sustained.
We talked a little bit before about, mentioned delusions of reference or ideas of reference. What does that mean, sir?
Okay. An idea of reference is the idea, and it's almost just what it sounds, the idea that something in the environment is referring to you when it's not. For example, it's raining because I don't feel good, or the news on TV about something, Justin Bieber, is really talking about me and myself. It can reach a level of delusion of reference if you truly believe it over a period of time, and it kind of becomes incorporated in the way you view the world.
This can also be called referential thinking. Sometimes people refer
Yes,
to it as.
yes.
And you're aware that Mr. Holmes exhibited some referential thinking. For example, in the jail when he heard the TV, the speech of President Obama. Is that right?
In November, I think he said that several months after he was arrested, according to him, yes.
And he also reported some other, believing he'd received some message from some movie as well. Do you recall that? I'm looking for it in my notes and not finding it.
I'm not remembering anything from a movie, if you're talking about within the jail, and if you're talking about in November, around the time that he had that psychotic break.
I am.
But I'm not remembering something about a movie, but it may well be there.
During that period of time, he also reported something called thought broadcasting. Is that right? Or the opposite, kind of, that others could read his thoughts.
Yes, and I believe that was in November in the jail as well, a long time after the shootings.
He said, when you talked to him about it, when he was at the hospital and in that rubber room, he thought others could read his thoughts. Right?
Something like that, I recall.
He said, I thought other people were reading my thoughts, so I tried to hide them. So I would say random colors like red, blue, green, and I would point in random directions to try to get them to stop listening to my thoughts.
Yes, I recall that.
And do you remember at that point you brought up, I do recall a video where you're pointing at different things around your cell.
Yes. And that once again was in November, either in the BC room. I'm pretty sure it was in the BC room. There was some unusual behavior in November in his MC cell as well.
Now, do you recall that Dr. Woodcock in his notes reported that Mr. Holmes exhibited referential thinking when he interviewed him?
I don't recall specifically. I've got Dr. Woodcock's notes in my bag over there, and I will take a good look at them at the break, but I don't recall that specifically.
Okay. When you talked with Mr. Holmes about his prelims, he told you he didn't prepare much at all for that, right?
Correct.
Said his advisor said to study everything, but he decided not to study, or didn't, right?
Didn't. Gave 2 or 3 different reasons at various times, but did not study for the prelims.
He told you, quote, I was focused on my mission.
That was one of the things that he said about not studying for the prelims.
At that point, he said it was 25% due to the mission, 75% due to not knowing what to study. Is that right?
Yes, I remember that.
And by June, he said that it flipped, that it was then 75% the mission. Is that right?
Yes, he said that in the interview.
Now, there are some things that you noted as being consistent with delusion or mental illness, and one of those things you mentioned was the burnt money thing that was in the notebook, right?
Yes, it seemed odd. I don't know why he burned the edges of the money. It seemed odd, which is one of the reasons I kept asking him about what the purpose might have been, to see if the purpose made sense, didn't make sense, sort of made sense, that kind of thing.
And even 2 years later, he's describing that somehow he's trying to send some message to Dr. Fenton about his insurance stopping and not being able to pay for the treatment. Is that right?
The things that he described about that were a bit confusing. It's as if they sort of were trying to make sense, but I didn't really get that it was a completely rational way of thinking about it.
It was kind of illogical. I mean, how would she know that he was saying that, right?
Accepting what he said 2 years later, you're correct. It was an illogical thing, in my opinion.
You spent a lot of time with the notebook. Many of the writings in the notebook are consistent with mental illness as well. Some are not, in your opinion, but some are. Right?
Consistent with, but do not prove, yes.
You spoke with him about the obsessive thoughts of the homicidal ideation. Is that right?
I don't know if I phrased it that way, but we talked a lot about his thoughts of killing people, going from the broad to the specific.
Sure. One of the things he said was that he was in his teens when he first started having these thoughts about killing, and they would just pop up. Is that right?
I believe that's what he said, yeah.
And he described them as a voice saying, kill people like your own mind voice. Is that right?
That's right. I need to clarify that I
You followed up.
followed up closely to see whether he was hearing a voice in his head or whether that was more a thought or a conscience or a something that was not an auditory hallucination.
And you determined that it was not, according to what he was saying at that time 2 years later, it was not an auditory hallucination that he was hearing. Am I right?
That was my impression, pretty firm impression, yes.
And he said it pretty clearly that it was an internal voice, a thought that is a voice in your head, were his words.
Yes.
The galactic colonization writings, I'm going to call them,
Okay.
the writings that he did in his cell, those also are consistent with delusion in a lot of ways. Is that right?
They're consistent with, there can be a lot of other ways to interpret them. Kind of depends what the person's thinking at the time. And of course, one part of it may be interpreted differently from another part of it.
And we know that he wrote these during the period of time when he was in his cell between his arrest and when he was hospitalized in November.
At some point in between, I think later rather than earlier, but I don't know.
And I don't know if any of the jail videos that you looked at from the first month, did you see him writing on paper in any of those jail visits?
I don't recall seeing anything in the first month where I was kind of spot checking, didn't see every day, that showed him writing. And he said that it was closer to the November time than to his arrest, but he wasn't all that certain either.
And he, did you note in any of the logs of the deputies when they noted that he was writing in his cell?
It may well be in the logs. I'm not remembering when or what they said in the logs.
Okay. So you don't recall that being in August or September?
I don't. It's not unusual for inmates to write and for correctional staff to write down that he's writing. I don't recall them saying what he was writing about.
Okay. You are aware, and I think you mentioned this to Mr. Holmes on the video, that at some point they searched his cell, which is normal when you're in jail, right? They always search your cell periodically. Fair to say?
Fair to say.
And that during a routine search of his cell, they found his writings and they made a report about it. Is that right?
Something like that. He says they weren't hidden, and I don't recall particularly whether it was viewed as unusual or contraband. I don't think so, but I basically don't recall from the logs.
Was that something that you considered, those writings? You told Mr. Broccoli you thought that those were important to consider. Is that right?
I think the writings are important. They come out of him at a time that I wasn't there and an earlier time. They can be looked at reasonably different ways. He's the only person who knows what he was thinking at the time, if he remembers, and people write things like that for lots of different reasons, as kind of came out in the discussion I had with him on the videos.
They were part of what you used and relied upon in the course of doing your evaluation and forming your opinions.
That's fair to say.
He told you that he thought those were important ideas to get down at the time. Is that right?
Yes, he did.
He also told you that since he was medicated, he no longer feels the need to write at all.
He no longer feels the need to write, or no longer particularly wants to write, and he associates that with the beginning of the medication.
And it's in those writings that are contained the ultraception symbol and the description of ultraception, and there are other writings that are in some ways similar to the writings in the notebook. Would you agree with that?
In some ways similar, in other ways not particularly. I recall thinking about it as the way lots of people write down their random thoughts or write down ideas about, and you heard us talk about string theory, what he called chain theory, things like that. And I'm aware that he's a pretty intelligent fellow, and so was wondering if he was having reasonable but outwardly odd sounding thoughts about the universe, so to speak, or whether these were odd and unreasonable sounding.
Meaning delusional. False beliefs.
Not necessarily delusional, but reflecting irrational thinking.
Well, let me ask you this. Is it true that when you kill other people, you increase in value? Is that a true statement or a false statement in reality?
In the way that you're asking it, and we're considering it here, no.
You testified more than once that there's no indication that you're aware of any hallucinations prior to November of 2012. Is that right?
The only indication that I know of is his description to me of the things that he calls shadows. Nothing other than that. And I'm very cautious about interpreting those as hallucinations. I see a number of other meanings or explanations for them that contrast with the kinds of hallucinations that come when one is, for example, having a schizophrenic break.
Understood. And I understand that's your opinion. What my question is that when he told you about these shadows, he told you that it was during his third rotation lab, right?
Yes.
And he told you he was sitting at his desk in the lab when it would happen to him, correct?
Yes.
And he would see a moving shadow flitting and reforming, correct?
Something like that, yes.
On the divider in front of the lab in front of him.
Yes, that's what he talked about.
He said they would split into two and gobble each other up and jump around, correct?
There was one time he explained them to me as blobs splitting in two and gobbling each other up. Another time that he described them, and I think I'm getting this right, a separate time he described them as being more like some sort of shadow figure.
And he described that there was nothing casting the shadow. Is that right?
He said he looked for something to cast the shadow, like a light, and didn't find that anything was casting a shadow.
So suffice it to say, he's either seeing something that's not there or he thinks he is, in hindsight, looking back.
In hindsight, looking back, assuming his reliability, that's correct.
You're aware that, as we noted from Dr. Fenton's note, mental status report, that she noted in June that Mr. Holmes denied to her having hallucinations, but that he, quote, glances around the room in an odd way.
That's what she wrote.
Do you recall that when in Dr. Gurr's report she asked him about seeing things that weren't there and to explain more about it, and he said, according to her, right there, and pointed at the wall behind her?
Yes, I recall that.
Do you remember that Dr. Woodcock, when he saw Mr. Holmes on the 23rd of July, reported in his notes, quote, hallucinations, visible movement without cause, dash, undergraduate?
I'm sure you're reading accurately from it. I don't recall the word undergraduate, but there was something about visual movement without cause.
Now, you talked to about the antipsychotic medication that Mr. Holmes is on. And is that Risperdal or Risperdal?
The trade name is Risperdal, Risperdal. The generic name is Risperidone.
So that would be like Advil and ibuprofen, two names to the same thing?
Yes, a trade name and a generic name.
And you talked about with Mr. Brockler about the side effects of these medications, some of the side effects. Do you remember
Yes.
that? I think you said sleepiness for a while might be a side effect. Is that right?
Yes.
Weight gain you talked about, right?
Over time, it sometimes is, yes.
The possibility of tremors, I think you said.
Yes.
Now,
And there are others. There was one that I left out, and I'm trying to remember which one it was, when talking with when being examined by Mr. Brockler. A bit of a stiffness.
okay. Now, when you or another psychiatrist prescribes medications, or any doctor for that matter, you don't prescribe them for their side effects, do you?
No, sometimes we consider equivalent medications, we consider the side effect profile, but we prescribe them for the symptoms that we hope they will alleviate.
For the direct effect, not the side effect, right?
That's a good way of saying it.
And the direct effect of antipsychotic medication is to help the patient deal with psychotic symptoms, right?
Not to help him deal with the psychotic symptoms, but rather to organize the thoughts and eliminate the psychoticness of the thoughts. There are some other direct effects that come from Risperdal, but that's the point of it.
To help organize the person's thinking.
To help the person's thinking become normal.
And the disorganization of thinking is one of the psychotic symptoms of schizophrenia that we saw in the schizophrenia spectrum disorder, right?
Of schizophrenia and of many kinds of psychosis as well as deliria.
Many kinds of different, right.
Yes.
Hallucinations. The antipsychotic medication can help alleviate some of the hallucinations or perhaps eliminate them.
In many people, it alleviates a little, a lot, or sometimes gets rid of them altogether.
It doesn't cure the disease of schizophrenia, for example,
That's correct.
or delusional disorder, correct?
Correct.
And it doesn't get rid of the negative symptoms of schizophrenia or the related type symptoms of schizotypal personality disorder. Is that right?
In some people, some of the newer antipsychotic medications, including Risperdal, help the negative symptoms, that is, make people a little more fluid, a little more outgoing, but the negative symptoms are tougher to treat in general than what you've referred to and we're referring to as the positive symptoms.
Mr. Holmes was first prescribed an antipsychotic medication in November by the psychiatrist at Denver Health Medical Center when he was hospitalized there. Is that right?
Correct.
And that was when they diagnosed him as being psychotic, and you testified your opinion was he was floridly psychotic at that point.
Yes.
And he was given first Haldol, which is a different kind of antipsychotic medication, is it not?
Yes, same purpose, older medication, different name, but for the same job.
And his psychiatric symptoms improved. His psychosis improved such that he was able to be discharged some days later from the hospital. Is that right?
They did. I need to clarify just to be sure that everything's accurate. The implication is that the antipsychotic medication helped clear the psychosis. It's certainly possible that being rehydrated, we know he was dehydrated, being out of the behavior control cell, which is a terrible place to be, being out of that, that there may be other things that contributed to his quickly getting better over just a few days, but the medication is likely to have been a big part of that.
Okay, let's just talk about that for a moment then. You're aware that Mr. Holmes went to the hospital for a CAT scan and then came back and then was sent back to be admitted a day later. Is that right?
Yes.
And when he was sent there for the CAT scan was almost right after the video where he runs his head into the wall and they strap him into the chair. Is that right?
I believe that's correct.
And when they strap him into the chair, a doctor comes in with a nurse and they give him an IV. Do you remember that?
Or someone comes in, a medic or a medical person, PA perhaps. Yes, I do remember that.
And to rehydrate him, correct?
That's my understanding. That's the logical reason they would start the IV, yes.
And then he went in the ambulance to the hospital, correct? Action Care ambulance?
As far as I know, I think I've seen the record of that.
And that's when he was repeating, you can't teach an old dog new tricks over and over and over and over again, right?
Somewhere in that chain of events, yes.
And on the hospital ride, to the ambulance ride to the hospital, he was given another IV, wasn't he?
I don't recall specifically, but it's logical that he would be continued on a hydrating IV. And there's another reason to give the IV, and that is to keep a vein open in case you need to medicate him quickly.
And he came back from the hospital that day, and the odd behaviors that were described previously in Dr. Sather's affidavit, the incoherent speech, the odd motioning, the rigid body, the feces, those continued. Is that right? And that's why he was sent back to the hospital.
Yes. I'm not sure whether or not they were briefly alleviated, but my view of it is that he was still having those behaviors until they sent him back to the hospital.
And when he was sent back to the hospital, he was again given another IV. Is that right?
I don't recall specifically, but it's very logical.
And we've provided you with interviews that we've done, we being the defense, with the doctors and some of the staff at Denver Health Medical Center that treated Mr. Holmes. Is that right?
If you're talking about the videos of him, or you're talking about transcripts of interviews with the individuals?
Talking about reports of interviews with the individuals.
I want to say I remember that. I'm not picturing them clearly, but there was a lot of documentation that you supplied about his experience there, what the various professionals said about it, things like that.
Do you recall a Dr. Caldwell at all? The head of the emergency medicine at Denver Health Medical Center?
I don't remember the name.
Okay. Do you remember if he was the first person that assessed Mr. Holmes? Do you remember that he said that he was, when asked by us whether he was dehydrated or not, he said mildly, if any?
I'll have to accept that if it's in the record. I don't remember specifically.
You don't remember reading in the report that he said, if I could have given him a glass of water to take care of it, I would have done that. But I couldn't because he wasn't responsive, so I had to give him an IV.
I don't remember that interchange.
Do you remember him describing Mr. Holmes, him asking Mr. Holmes questions and Mr. Holmes responding to him in gibberish? I'll move on.
The objection is sustained.
Mononucleosis.
Mr. King, before you move on to your next topic, would
Yes,
this
sir.
be a good time to take a break?
Sure.
All right, why don't we do that? Folks, it's about 12 o'clock. Let's take our second morning break. Let's take 15 minutes. Please keep in mind all my advisements during the break. I'll see you back here in about 15 minutes. Thank you. Please be seated, everyone. The record should reflect that the jury has exited the courtroom. Mr. King, I'm not trying to rush you by any means, just wondering for scheduling purposes about how much longer do you think you have?
Hour?
An hour? Okay. All right, and then, Mr. Brockler, do you know whether you're going to have any redirect or much redirect?
I think I will, and I think it'll probably be at least an hour, given the areas that we're going into here.
Okay. All right, well, then we might have to have Dr. Reed continue after the lunch break, the late lunch break that we have today, it sounds like. Okay. All right, enjoy the break. I'll see you back here in 15. The court will be in recess.
Please rise.